sales enablement is often called in to be the voice of the salesperson, which I
Yeah.
think is really important any time that you're in either the driver's seat or an influential seat in some of these buying decisions. So I think it just depends on, what service you're looking at. Sales enablement is a consumption-based model. Just because we bought the licenses doesn't mean that the salespeople are going to use it. So I
Yeah.
have to make sure that I'm going to purchase something that ultimately is going to be worth every seller's time. They're not going to get up and walk out of the room, because if they do, I've failed.
Welcome to another episode of the How to Sell podcast. I am your co-host. I actually don't like saying that, Dave, because when I used to host
It
this
hurts,
podcast
doesn't
on
it?
my own, he says, I'm your host, Luigi Prestinenzi. But unfortunately, I have a co-host who is a Chelsea fan. We haven't spoken about that. You're a Chelsea fan, Dave.
Big Chelsea fan. After even my daughter's named Chelsea, which
Ah,
gives a glimpse into the craziness in this house.
yeah. Well, Chelsea's doing great things at the moment. Winning against Luton Town 1-0 for those football fans out there. But this is not a podcast to talk about football, even though we always start the episode talking something about football. But yes, we've got a great episode this week, David. Again, jumping into the trenches, talking to another incredible person from the enablement space. But what was your key takeaway from the last session with Regan?
I think it's just leveraging the power of buying and bringing in the team members, see where else, the vendor can help other parts of the business
Mm.
without just focusing and being one dimensional. That's how that provider lost the deal on
Yeah,
that case.
it was pretty interesting, wasn't it?
Was
Yeah. Well, we'll jump into this week's episode, and we're pretty fortunate and privileged to have somebody from an absolutely enormous brand where a lot of people probably use the platform in some capacity if they're buying online and they might not even know it. But just want to say welcome to the How to Sell podcast, Katie.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, we're pretty excited. And obviously, I heard you recently on one of our good friends' podcasts, Donald C. Kelly, the sales evangelist, and you dropped some
Yeah,
real
that was a
nuggets.
lot of fun.
Yeah. Awesome. But before we jump into today's session, would love to get your, just a bit of background and how you got into enablement. Obviously, you've worked with some huge brands such as Google, but yeah, why enablement?
Yeah, good question. So probably like many of the folks that are listening, and you guys as well, I started with carrying a bag. So I actually started in sales to put myself through college. I sold large travel packages, and then I was supposed to. My degree's in criminology. I thought I wanted to be a parole officer, actually, but I found I found that I could make more money in sales than I could as a parole officer. And so I did sales for a long time, everywhere from like inside sales, SDR work, all the way up to enterprise sales.
Mm.
And then I was that person that would get up in the middle of our training and I would leave, right? Because I didn't think it was worth my time. And so at the time, Google said to me, like, hey, you either need to go to the training or you need to figure out something better. And I was like, well, give it to me. I'll figure out something better. So that's how I got my start in enablement before enablement
Yeah.
was really a thing, is getting up and leaving trainings that I didn't think were worth my time.
And it's funny because I remember when we started working together, over a year ago. It would have been over a year ago now. I remember you telling me that story and saying, yeah, I got up out of training one day and I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to be training you and your team. What if you get up and walk
No
out?
Sayonara, peace out.
Yeah. But that's really interesting, right? Because obviously I feel I feel that pain because obviously as a sales professional my whole life, I've been thrown into sales training sessions and you kind of sit there and switch off in some cases. So I actually would love, just before we obviously jump into our topic of, the how to sell, but um, there's one thing that you do very differently from an enablement perspective that not a lot of companies actually execute, which I think more companies should do, which is the teach back. Can you maybe just talk us through the teach back model that you've incorporated, the practicums in your business?
Yeah, so to me it's pretty intuitive, right? So it doesn't feel like something unique that we're doing. It just feels like something that everyone should be doing, to be honest with you. But so a lot of the programs that we do, the managers are actually the professors, or the sellers are the
Yeah.
professors, right? Because they're really the ones that are doing it day in and day out.
Mm.
And so, if I'm not going to lead a training on how to create the best proposal, I'm going to go out and get the last three AEs that signed big deals,
Mm.
and have them come in and talk about their proposal process, what worked, what didn't work. And so we've actually found that to be pretty successful at
Mm.
Stripe. Everyone is kind of in a give get relationship where the AEs want to show off what they've done. Like
Yeah.
they worked really hard at it, so we want to give them an opportunity to show off what they've done. And then the SDRs and other folks are really eager to learn. So it seems to be a nice flywheel effect, if you will,
Mm.
that's working for us at the moment.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've loved it, and I've obviously had the privilege and the pleasure of seeing it live, and it's awesome, because it's a different level of respect as well, right? When you've got an SDR or an AE hearing from somebody that has been there or is still doing it,
Mm.
they just see it from a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, Luigi, you were doing a training for us a while back, and during the training, you were like, I don't know, let's give it a whirl. And you picked up the phone and made a cold call, right?
Yeah,
And that was really powerful in the room. And now all of the managers do that as professors for like a very similar enablement session that we do, where they're like, okay, everyone, we did the programmatic research, we did this, we did that. Like, let's pick up the phone. And they pick up the phone in the room and they do a cold call.
That's
yeah,
good.
So, yeah,
pretty powerful, wasn't it?
yeah, it was good. It was a good
Yeah.
one.
I must admit, my stomach does drop every time I do that because I'm always worried what's going to be the outcome of this.
Yeah.
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 Well, obviously, the framework of our show here is about we really want to help sellers understand how they can position themselves when they're engaging with buyers. And obviously, Katie, even though you're in a position where you're building the enablement roadmap, you're also buying, and you're buying software and you're buying services all the time. So, would love to really understand from an enablement perspective, where do like are you the influencer or are you the ultimate decision maker when it comes to buying products?
Yeah, good question. So, like in all things, I think it depends, right? So, if
Mm.
I'm going out and buying a sales enablement platform like a high spot or something like that, then obviously I'm in the driver's seat,
Yeah.
because that's kind of my realm of kind of my domain expertise. However, there have been situations where I'm an influencer,
Mm.
and my level of influence, it really depends on, not only what position I'm in now, but what I've done in the past, right? Like I've stood up CRMs in
Yeah.
past roles. And so anytime that we're looking to do a CRM integration or a plugin or something like that, people often come my ways. And I find this to be the same for a lot of my kind of colleagues in the sales enablement world, where sales enablement is often called in to be the voice of the salesperson, which I
Yeah.
think is really important any time that you're in either the driver's seat or an influential seat in some of these buying decisions. So I think it just depends on, what service you're looking at.
Mm.
That's an interesting one there, Katie. And can you walk us through where you were brought into a decision buying process in a good way, and on the flip side, in a bad way, we sort of put you back up, potentially where you may have been in the last minutes, or do you have a situation on both sides?
Yeah, for sure. So I think in situations where it's worked well is, obviously it all goes back to the pain point, right? Like
Mm.
what problem are you going to solve for the salespeople? And so in those situations, obviously there's a lot of momentum and a lot of energy that comes. I can just speak for myself, for me,
Hmm.
and trying to help solve that problem, right? So conversation intelligence tools, right?
Mm.
Something like that, where I think there's a lot of value that could be added to a salesperson's motions. Um, Times when it hasn't worked as well, usually usually for me, it's and this is a bias on my side, where I feel like you're going to increase the operational burden to a salesperson.
Right.
Mm.
So if another team needs better reporting, or they need a better tool to do XYZ, I think if they don't bring sales enablement in early, like sales enablement is often going to be the blocker because we have to be the sales, the voice of the salesperson.
That's really interesting. And where have you found yourself like having to influence someone to implement a solution where you know that your team needs this particular coaching service product, but you don't have the buying power? How how have you influenced that decision maker within the business?
Yeah, I think you have to create FOMO, right? Like
Ah,
people at their core don't want to miss out on something.
yeah.
So I think it's really important. Like when I've been successful at influencing budget, especially right now when
Mm.
budget is hard to come by,
Mm,
right? It's like, what is the cost of not doing something? Or where are they going to lose if they don't put this into play?
nice, nice.
Yeah, I love that. The cost of inaction, right?
Mm.
And I'd
Yeah.
love to know, like, is there a recent purchase that you've made where the selling organization helped you define that cost of inaction? And how did they do it? Because I always love to hear those stories. Like, how does a selling organization actually share with the buyer, hey, this is the cost of not doing anything?
So I think ultimately, like in my role, I become the salesperson,
Mm.
in those situations, right? So if I'm a really good salesperson in those situations, and maybe this is just because I've carried a bag in the
Yeah.
past, but I need to create that FOMO for my salespeople so that ultimately they're the ones that are pushing it through. And I'm just kind of behind the scenes making sure that their voices are heard, right? So, what are they unable to do without this? Where are they missing revenue because they don't have this? Um, how are they, less productive because they don't have something? Again, it's like this whole fear of missing out because there's gains for sure. You can sell on gains, but it's easier to sell on FOMO, in my opinion.
Because that's the emotion, right?
For sure. And no
Yeah.
one likes to be left behind, right?
Yeah.
Especially like I work in the tech space. No one wants to be kind of, left behind in the tech space.
Pardon the interruption, but I have to let you know about this free resource. The Grow Forum newsletter has over 10,000 subscribers that are learning how to sell. Each and every week, we send you tips, strategies, and also some tools and tech on how to achieve the most out of your sales pipeline. If you're ready to level up, sign up for free at growforum.io/newsletter and get the first issue this week.
Yeah. It is actually, it's really interesting because that's a very different perspective. The perspective that you're bringing is that you're becoming the salesperson internally, and that's the way you're influencing others, not just the buying committee, but also the people that need to use the product, right? Because there's nothing
For
worse than
sure.
buying something and the people that you're meant to serve with that product or service, if they don't come on board, then it becomes a purchase that doesn't deliver the right ROI.
Well, and then it's not worth any of our time,
Yeah.
right? Like, why do I want to spend time? Because all of these purchases take a lot of time and a lot of effort,
Yeah.
not only to just get the, signed and get the budget, but to implement and onboard and all of those things.
Mm,
Like, it's a big time investment to actually purchase something.
It's
mm.
like two cycles, right? Like you mentioned there, it's the initial cycle of getting the product in the business, and then the cycle two of adoption, of
Yeah.
ensuring that they win it. It's similar to like in any tech business where you made the sale, now they need to implement the product. Otherwise, Stripe doesn't make any money unless it's implemented.
I
Um,
mean, sales enablement is a consumption-based model,
mm,
right? Like just because we bought the licenses doesn't mean that the salespeople are going to use it. So I
Yeah.
have to make sure that, to your point, that I'm going to purchase something that ultimately is going to be worth every seller's time. They're not going to get up and walk out of the room because if they do, I've failed.
Yeah.
mm.
Has that, and do you mind me asking, has that happened in the last
Oh,
couple
for
of years?
sure.
Yeah.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like I think about a time where, sales leadership was saying, and they rightfully so were saying like, hey, we need to go back to the fundamentals.
Mm.
We need to go back to the fundamentals, bring in folks, have them train all of our salespeople. We did it. We spent a lot of money doing that. but the salespeople themselves, like the AEs, especially experienced AEs back in that situation, didn't want to be there. They didn't
Yeah.
feel like they really needed the fundamentals. And I hadn't created an attraction economy
Mm.
where, they saw the value. So,
Yeah.
I mean, in that situation, I would say that I failed because I didn't call out um, the disconnect between what I was seeing from senior leadership and the real needs of the business when I made that purchase.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So on that point, right, you've mentioned that you failed, but from the selling organization, so the organization that engaged with you to bring those fundamentals in place, right? Because I'm assuming that was an external company.
Hmm.
I mean, would you expect, like looking back now, would you expect that, or upon reflection, shouldn't they have done an analysis to define that this could be a problem, that your sellers might not want to hear the fundamentals, and this is maybe a strategy that we need to use first?
So probably,
Mm.
right? But I think that goes into like, I obviously didn't sign a renewal with that company.
Yeah,
Um, um, so I think, just looking back on that particular situation, like we trained thousands of people or attempted to train
yeah,
thousands of people globally using this vendor, and it didn't work. I would have loved for them to say like, okay, time out, something's not working, let's pivot.
yeah,
So I think it was on them to keep on going, and frankly, again, on me to keep the sessions going. But ultimately, they sold us what we thought we wanted and needed at the time. So I think
mm,
if there's any quote unquote blame to be put on them, it's that they didn't pivot halfway through.
yeah,
Mm.
And that's what I would expect from vendors nowadays. If something's not working, they need to be looking at this like I am, like a consumption-based business. And
mm,
if people aren't consuming, then like time out. Let's rethink this purchase.
yeah. Because I think what you're describing, that's what creates future biases. Like people then start to, when they're looking at other solutions, because of past experiences, it creates sort of some concerns and fears. And this is a topic that we've discussed, not just with others, but it's a topic that I'm constantly talking to sellers about. It's needing to understand the past, because that will help you determine the business case. And if that's something that's happened previously, then you can at least say, in that business case, you can build out what is the strategy if this occurs, right? And how we're
Hmm.
going to work through that, because that could become the ultimate blocker, right? That could become, in your case, if you're selecting another vendor for training, you might say, well, I haven't got the confidence in you because we haven't addressed something that actually occurred previously.
Yeah, and I think what you're calling out is, you need to meet your buyers where they're at,
Mm,
right? Like in this situation, I was the buyer, and what I needed at the moment was flexibility. I needed a vendor or someone selling to me that could be agile, right? So I think it's about again meeting folks where they're at and really conveying that you can do things like that because
mm,
some vendors aren't flexible, right? Like
yeah,
if I go out and buy 50 licenses and then I hire 400 people, like I need someone that can scale with me,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So those are other things that you have to think about when you're buying. It's just like if I latch myself to this vendor, because that's what you're doing is you're latching yourself or creating a relationship with this vendor, are they able to go with me over the course of
mm.
time?
That's a great point. And what does, like, when you're working with a vendor, Katie, and what does a business case look like? How is it presented to you? And then what's the process internally to get that signed off within a business of Stripe size?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know that my experience has been any different than what I've heard in like typical sales trainings,
Mm.
right? I always say that for me, moving to an internal role, sometimes I find myself working harder on my sales skills than I did when I was carrying a bag,
Yeah.
right? So because I need to going back to the FOMO, I need to show why now, why this
Mm.
solution, what people are missing out on. I have to build my champions, like all of those things that you would do in a normal sales cycle. If I was selling to customers externally, I have to do internally.
Mm.
And at the end of the day, I have to stand behind my decision because these are also the people that are doing my performance review, right? So,
Yeah.
so I have to make sure that the sale really goes well.
Mhm.
And it's like added pressure, if anything.
Yeah.
For
Mm.
sure, right? Like I need this one to stick. It's
Mm.
not a sale that I can say like, oh, good to go, like move on to the next go.
Yeah.
I have to put my political capital behind this one.
Yeah. Because your reputation's at stake as well, right? This is the thing, that
For sure.
if you're endorsing something and it doesn't work, then it could negatively impact your brand within the business, right?
For sure. I mean, everyone loves to say that like you learn for your failures, and you absolutely do.
Yeah.
But like you don't want to get known for your failures, right?
Yeah.
So so you have to make sure that, you might fail once in a while, but you have to have more wins than losses at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And every time you make a purchase, it is a win or
Mm.
a loss.
Yeah.
And is that sometimes like in the back of your head when you're looking at a large purchase or a purchase of some form, and you're kind of going, if this doesn't work, how is this going to impact the way my peers view me or the way my bosses view me?
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Like I am spending the company's money,
Yeah.
right? Or I am taking up sellers' time, which in my opinion is probably the most valuable resource that the
Mm.
company has. And so it's on me to be really diligent about that.
Yeah. And
It's great psychology getting into the seller's mind here when selling to enablement, all the things that they need to be really aware
yeah.
of, right? Time of the team, reputation of the buyer, all these key factors here that a lot of people just miss in that buying journey.
Yeah, because sometimes it
Yeah.
doesn't get addressed,
Hmm.
right? And we
Well,
heard
and
that.
I think sales enablement also sits within a really interesting spot, or at least it has for me, because ultimately you're kind of in this triangle, if you will, of like you have stakeholders that are salespeople. When you're making a technology decision, you also have stakeholders that are systems and tools and
Mm.
processes people. Usually, sales enablement flows up to some sort of revenue operations
Mm.
leader,
Hmm.
right? So you have them, and then you also usually have HR or L&D.
Yeah.
So those are all of, when I think about my buying committee and who I need to influence to make a purchase, I need to influence all of those
Yeah.
folks.
And you've also got marketing, right? Because marketing's
Oh,
doing
for sure.
the top of funnel that's feeding your SDR sort of unit.
Yeah.
So that's quite a wide. It's interesting, and it's really interesting because we spoke with Gal, who's the founder of Aligned, and they build digital sales rooms, and he shared some really interesting stats on what they've seen, that if you're in a small medium enterprise or small medium deal, if you think there's three stakeholders, there's usually six. If you're in a mid to large, if you think there's six stakeholders, there's usually 12, right? So the actual buying committee is bigger than what we first think about. So, and it's interesting that you shared that because you just kind of mapped out what that looked like. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, there's different decision making like frameworks, if you will, whether
Yeah.
you want to use rapid or racy or you name it. But I think whenever you're selling to someone, you need to understand not only who the decision maker is, but like who needs to agree, who needs to
Mm.
influence or consult, or understanding kind of that whole framework is really important.
Yeah, this is so good. And could you maybe just tell us, like, a really good experience that you've had buying something, and what did the salesperson do that really made that experience memorable for you?
So I think if I think back to kind of, I'll take you through a technology sale. So I made a purchase of a CRM a
Yep.
few years ago at a previous company, and I think what the salesperson did at the time was just be brutally honest,
Mm.
right? Like just the brutal honesty. I would also say at the time I didn't recognize it, but she was definitely more of a consultative sales
Mm.
approach. and she didn't necessarily care about the licenses. So I really kind of going back to this idea that you have to sell on a consumption-based model. She took that to heart because
Mm.
it was like, look, I'm actually going to undersell you on licenses and I'm going to put you on a managed services contract, and then we'll increase it as we go, right? But it's on me to make people want to use the CRM,
Yeah.
which I thought was no, I've never found a seller that says I love my CRM, right?
Mm.
So like that was a tough position for her to put herself in. So I think just she put herself in a position where she had stake in the game,
Mm.
and responsibility to make it work. And I think that made it an easier or less of a risky buy for me.
Mm.
I like that. It's like she's put her, like you said, skin in the game. She understands the
Hmm.
CRM's a massive, massive purchase for any business, and adoption is the killer
Yeah.
of CRMs. Right? So that's where she's put her neck on the line to
Mm.
ensure that it works, and you have her support. I like that.
Do you have a great product but are struggling to reach more customers? Are you spending hours on sales activities that aren't generating results, leaving you feeling frustrated and discouraged? The Sales OS program is a step-by-step operating system that will help you slash your selling hours in half while rapidly growing your revenue. In under just 2 weeks, you can be well on your way to creating predictable revenue. In Sales OS, we'll show you how to build predictable sales pipeline, build lasting relationships with your customers, and sell more in less time. The art of negotiation and motivating and leading a successful sales team. If this sounds like something that you need in your business, visit growforum.io/sales and apply to see if you have the right mindset to achieve predictable revenue. The Sales OS program is your ticket to predictable revenue. Don't wait any longer, apply today.
It's not like when you buy a house, right? Like at
No,
least
that's
when
right.
I've bought properties or something, it's like, okay, you bought your house. Adios, amigo. Hope you like it. It was the exact opposite of that. So
Yeah. And it's an interesting model, right? And also, she's obviously sold it, but I'm assuming because you hadn't bought heaps of licenses at the start, that the salesperson continued to engage with you through that process.
for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, we had bi-weekly calls. How's it going? She
Mm.
would send me the results. Like, here's how many active users you have. Here's how many contacts have been uploaded. Here's how
Mm.
many people have pulled reports. So again, kind of
That's
just going
intense.
into this, she had a stake in the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's intense. That's awesome.
So it's very
Hmm.
different to the modern day model, right? Where it's whole I sell handball off to the next person, and like
Mm.
you said, adios. And then all of a sudden, that relationship is kind of potentially lost, right? Which I'm a big advocate for that relationship funnel. You're as a salesperson, the your your bank, your equity is in the relationships that you build, because no matter where you go, potentially you can actually bring those relationships with you.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I
Mm.
would like to think that her comp was on like total revenue, right? And not activated revenue. But I mean, either way, she made me feel like I was really important. And like I said, that she had skin in the game. So,
Yeah, so
Yeah,
good.
that's a good point. What Katie mentioned, right? It comes down to the compensation model for that seller on how are they incentivized. If it's
Mm.
to go along the journey retention, then it's a smart move that she did. But if it's just on net new sales, then it's sold Katie, bang onto the next one. So it's
Mm.
inbred
100%.
into the model.
Yeah. And I think that's important. If you're a sales leader or building a company, or you're in charge of compensation, I think early in my career, I underestimated how compensation plays a role and what
Mm.
people sell, what people buy.
Mm.
All of those things matter.
Yeah.
And let's flip the funnel a little bit here. Let's go back to top of the funnel. When dealing with salespeople, what triggers you to take a meeting if someone's reaching out to you?
Yeah. Um, this is tried and true.
Yeah.
And actually, Luigi, you preach this till you're blue in the face, which is like they know me,
Yeah.
right? Or they've attempted to know me. They're not trying to sell me something that's kind of either off the shelf or I could be interested, things like
Mm.
that. it's the exact opposite of folks that call me and they're like, hey, they give me kind of their spiel and I say, what company do you think I work for? And it's usually they're telling me a company I worked for 2 years ago,
Yeah.
right? Or 3 years ago.
Mm.
So I think personalization and just understanding where I might be in my buying cycle is really important.
Yeah. It is.
Love
It's
it.
important, right? And I actually got one. I've got it a couple times actually, saying, "Hey, we can help you scale your restaurant business." I'm like, "That's fantastic."
That's amazing.
I don't know where my restaurant business is, but if you,
Maybe
like,
it's
it's great
your name
research.
puts them off.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
we
don't cook. You can ask my kids. Like, you know.
Hey, this has been awesome, Kate. I actually I've got notes of my takeaways, and we could probably turn this into like 4 different episodes because there's
mm,
so much quality content that you've shared with us. But we are almost at the time to wrap up. But for our listeners and for our audience that would love to engage and learn more about what you do, where is the best place? And we'll obviously put that in the show notes. But where is the best place for them to find and engage with you?
Great question. LinkedIn.
Okay.
So I'm US based, so LinkedIn
Yep.
is kind of king or queen here. So just hit me up there and we can take the conversation forward.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this has been fantastic, Katie. Just want to say thank you very much for being a guest, but also for, like I said, you had a really big impact on me when I was able to see those practicums live. It really did change my perspective on what's possible from an enablement perspective. And I believe that is a concept every enablement person should see live because it's fantastic when you flip it, right? When you flip it from you're not the facilitator, you're actually empowering the people that you're serving to become the facilitators. And it's such a great concept. So thank you very much for the impact that you've had on me.
Well, thank you guys for doing this. I've listened to quite a few of your podcasts and they're great. So thanks for having me on.
thank you, Katie.
Hey, Dave, what an awesome, awesome session.
Yeah, that was great. There was so
Yeah.
many takeaways there from Katie. I guess like one of the big things, if I talk about my biggest takeaway from that was, the risk of her role when she's
Mm.
selling internally.
Yeah.
She's using the company's money. Like she
Mm.
said, she needs to make sure her boss is on board. And then she needs to
Mm.
make sure her team is on board, make sure that they adopt the sales training, the tools, whatever it is that she's
Yeah.
buying. It's that is a really tough role.
Yeah. And, also, I think something that I probably didn't consider was what if it doesn't work? Yeah.
Yeah.
The brand impact. And, we sometimes look at, oh, if it doesn't work, that they're spending money that might not deliver an ROI. But
Mm.
that emotional aspect is probably has more of an impact because that personal brand internally could be tarnished if something doesn't work well. So for me, that was a pretty big takeaway.
Yeah, like she used the term like politician, right? I
Yeah.
got to use my political capital, and we know, like any politician, you're only as good as your last decision that you've made. So if you
Yeah.
make, you could make 5 great ones, make a really bad one, and you're almost 1 foot out the door.
Yeah.
People start to turn against you. There's someone better that can take your role, someone better that can move the company forward. So
Yeah.
it's, I never thought about it in that way where you're, it's like a little campaign, political campaign internally to
Yeah.
to buy something and then to sell it internally, like that cycle. So I think from
Mm.
a seller, if we flip the hat, it's great to understand these things because then as soon as you're aware of them, it's
Mm.
how can you help Katie in her role,
Yeah.
knowing what you know now and the
Mm.
challenges that she has. How do you help Katie overcome those?
Mm.
Because that will make you stand out as the supplier of choice versus someone who
Yeah.
doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump in. So how would we sell to Katie? Like with, another enablement folk, different perspective, very different, a little bit different social style in comparison to Regan, right? And obviously we've got other incredible enablement folks coming up as well. So we'll dive into this. But I think the first thing, obviously in any initial conversation that you'd have, if I was selling to Katie for the first time, and in fact, I've had the pleasure I was that person carrying the bag and winning that account with Stripe. And Katie was my key stakeholder. In understanding her need, like she said, that FOMO, she spoke about, the cost of doing nothing, etc. That example that she shared of saying, "Hey, I used a previous vendor. We did all this training. It didn't fundamentally work." I actually did pull that out early in the conversation with her,
How'd you do that?
because I asked past-based questions, right? I asked questions around, talk me through the last initiative that you did from using an external vendor. What worked well? What would you do differently?
Mhm.
Right? I asked those questions, and Katie shared the answers. Katie said, "Hey, this is what I like, but this didn't work. Right? This was the impact." So, in understanding the impact and the issue that she had experienced previously, I was unable to bring that into the proposal. I was able to bring that into our conversation, and we spoke about it. And that's where I positioned a few options to allow her to have that consumption-based model.
Have you ever had at a time where you could sense that they had a bad experience in the past, but they're not being open and sharing that? And it's critical, for you to put to have that information to put a solid proposal together. Have you worked around that?
That's why I use the what worked well, and I don't ask questions like, "Hey, what didn't work well?" I say, "If you could go back and do it
Mm,
again, what would you do differently?" Because it's not a negative question,
yeah.
and you're not asking them to say, "Well," because sometimes, especially if they chose the previous provider, they don't want to say, "Hey, this was a disaster. This didn't work," and blah blah blah. So
Mm,
say, "What would you do differently?" Yeah, it's kind of a coaching based question,
mm,
right? Think about it. A coach would ask, "Hey, this is great. This is what I saw you do well. What did you do well? What would you do differently if you could
mm,
go back and do it again?" So it's a coaching question, but you're using it in the sales process. And so that then allows them in a safe space, because it's not a negative question. They don't have to go on the defensive. Yeah. So tension doesn't rise up. Think about that relationship tension. It's still
yeah.
reduced. So they say, "Well, this is what I would have done differently." And say, "Great. Okay. Thanks for sharing that. And do you mind me asking, if that's what you've done differently, what was the impact of X, right? What could have been the outcome if you did this?" And all of a sudden, you're getting a bit of a picture into what occurred, right? And then as a salesperson, I would then craft exactly like I did in that scenario. I would then craft what the desired state needs to look like in the business case for change. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's great.
And create a couple of scenarios around that, because that's the other key, is options is pretty important to a person like Katie. Yeah.
Mm,
Providing a few options so that internally, Katie can then go around that buying committee and see which is the best option that's going to get the best adoption, right?
yeah.
Because that was something that's important. She mentioned adoption is key. Yeah, this is not a she's not working with a team of 10 sellers. She's working with a team of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people all
Yeah.
over the world, in the thousands,
Yeah. The
right?
impact will be shown if something's
Correct.
not adopted or if something's not working.
Absolutely, right? So that's a couple of things that I would probably, advocate to any seller, anyone listening to this, anyone watching this. It's diving into the past is an amazing opportunity to help you scope what the future state needs to look like. And if you're not doing it, just start by doing, when you did X, what worked well, and if you could go back and do it again, what would you do differently? Just start with those questions, and you'll be amazed at the intel that you'll gather, and how you can then start to think about what that future state needs to look like and embed that into your proposal.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect note to end this episode on, Louis. Well done.
Yeah, awesome. So for all of our folks out there, all of our community members, we're going to continue down this path. So we've got another episode that's going to be dropping, and that's with Jacob Dave. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. Jacob's
Yeah.
the first one. Yeah, it's coming out.
Yeah, and that is he's a CFO, so very different take. He's going to look at things from a different lens, which is important, right? Obviously, then we've got other episodes dropping. Continue with enablement, continue with CFOs. So this is critical, right? Because in order for us to sell during any economic climate, we need to sell the way our buyers buy. So these conversations will help you get a different understanding and change your perspective on how you can sell to the way your buyers buy.